The First Minister has been urged by rivals to explain why the Scottish Government under Nicola Sturgeon wanted to restart its Scexit conversation during the first few months of the COVID pandemic, with him being the Justice Secretary at the time. Humza Yousaf has been urged to explain his role in the Scottish Government's scandalous decision to push for independence at the height of the COVID pandemic. We previously told how bombshell documents published by the UK COVID inquiry showed that during a cabinet meeting, ministers and officials discussed restarting work on breaking up the UK. Retired civil servant Ken Thompson was confronted with this evidence during a hearing on Friday and failed to answer when quizzed about whether the SNP executive had attempted to politicise the deadly virus. In cabinet minutes from June 2020, officials agreed that consideration should be given to restarting work on independence and the referendum, with the arguments reflecting the experience of the coronavirus crisis and developments on EU exit. The current First Minister was Justice Secretary at the time and has now been urged to explain this shameful decision and whether he was involved in it. Scottish Tory Shadow Constitution Secretary Donald Cameron submitted a topical question to the Scottish Parliament's presiding officer about this scandal. He has called on Mr Yousaf to come clean about what was discussed at the meeting, why, and whether he voiced any concerns about scandalous decision to focus on SNP political objectives during a public health emergency. He said, "This astonishing and shameful revelation from the UK COVID inquiry explains why Nicola Sturgeon and many of her senior colleagues were so keen to delete their WhatsApp messages. If a discussion on pushing their independence obsession was talked about around the cabinet table, we can only imagine the extent of the SNP's crass constitutional opportunism on private messaging. The Scottish people are entitled to know why a government that assured us public safety was its sole focus was gaming its push for another independence referendum while the death toll mounted." Humza Yousaf was a senior figure around the cabinet table at the time. Did he voice any objections to this disgracefully skewed priority? If not, why not? I have this morning submitted a topical question. If it's selected, I would urge the First Minister, in the interests of his own credibility and integrity, to respond on behalf of his government. The Scottish people deserve an explanation for the scandalous decision to focus on SNP political objectives during a public health emergency. Ms Sturgeon is also facing growing pressure to explain her actions during the pandemic and her decision to delete her WhatsApps dating from that time period. She insisted that all relevant information has been passed to the inquiry, but admitted wiping her messages. And her involvement in attempting to restart the conversation about breaking up the UK despite hundreds of people dying due to coronavirus daily will also be scrutinised in the coming weeks. She is scheduled to give evidence to the inquiry next week.